Okay, guys, I'm trying something a little bit different tonight. So please bear with me. That should just about do it. Okay, before I start with the presentation for tonight, I want to know, are there any questions about the assignment? I'm assuming everybody's seen my email. Your assignment, you've got an extension for 1 week. Any questions? Anybody want to ask something about the assignment? I'll give opportunity at the end of the after I've done the presentation for tonight. I'll also give opportunity then. But is there anybody that wants to ask anything now, or should we wait until the end? Okay, I take the silence as nobody's wanting to ask anything. I'm sharing my screen because I want to use Prezi tonight. And that also means that I can't really see if you type anything in the box. It's not going to pop up on my side. So please feel free to open your mics and speak if you want to ask me anything. So we're looking at quality assurance tonight. So we deep into chapter or learning unit 3, and going to look at how quality assurance works and so on. I think it's the last question in the final POE. The other questions we've dealt with. So let's dive into quality assurance in higher education. Let's see what's going on there. So quality assurance or quality management is obviously an important part of higher education. We need to have some kind of approach that we can make sure that because we work on a SAQA system and an NQF system, we need to make sure that everything in our country is the same standard. And therefore, we need to have some kind of a control mechanism where we can make sure that what one university is doing is the same as what another university does. But this also goes further, because we also need to say that if your institution is giving somebody a degree, you are certifying a certain amount of learning has taken place. And that learning should then be transferable into anywhere in the world. There's big work being done at the moment in terms of the EU and the transferability of qualifications within the EU, and also how those qualifications then transfer further. I know from my own institution, from Varsity College, I've had students take our qualifications and go to many other countries, ranging from Australia through to Austria, the Netherlands, the UK. I think I've even had one or two go to the US, not with the 49 before that. And so we have to have this monitoring and evaluation, and all the whole thing is not just about standards, it's also about the student's experience. That students experience the university experience, their experience during tertiary education as a positive experience, as a developmental experience. But also one that is at the same level of other experiences that other people in other institutions are having during their time as a student. Now, institutional reputation obviously then goes hand in hand with your quality management system. And this is where we get the first conundrum, because in South Africa, if you get a BCom degree from an institution, it doesn't matter which institution you get that BCom from. It's a BCom degree. It carries exactly the same weight. Because I'm involved with a private higher education institution, I'm always faced with questions about, but is this the same? And I always say to graduates, and I say to parents, no university may refuse you based on the standard of the qualification. They can refuse you on content. They can refuse you on your performance, but they cannot refuse you to study further in terms of the level of the qualification. I was privileged enough to, when Varsity College rolled out their BCom degree, I taught on the first BCom program, and the first graduates, I taught them in the third year in business management. And there were a couple of guys that wanted to go to UCT, and they'd applied to UCT, and UCT basically turned the applications down and said to them, no, we're not taking you. You do not qualify to come into an honors program because the level of your qualification isn't high enough. And obviously that caused quite a bit of a ruckus to the students on campus and saying, listen here, you've sold the qualification, or you've sold us on the level of the qualification, now it's worth nothing. And we simply referred it to our registrar. Our registrar phoned UCT's registrar, and those guys all got letters within like 24 hours. Said, yes, you've been accepted, no problems. Because you can't refuse on the level of the qualification, because they're all the same. But the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are they all the same? Is the qualification that a student gets from Intech the same as Varsity College, the same as UCT, the same as Stellenbosch, the same as KZN, and I can name a number of other universities? And what has happened in the market is that because the quality management isn't always what it should be, and the universities aren't always at the same level, the graduate employability has started to dictate this. So what now happens is the employer determines who they want and who they don't want, and determines which universities' degrees are worth more than the other one. And that's one of the reasons why you need this quality management, why your quality control should be so good, because it upholds those educational standards. It makes sure that what you're doing today, you improve on in the next day, and that you continuously trying to improve your qualifications, improve your student experience, and eventually improving the employability of your students in the market out there. So the demand, obviously, for higher education has grown globally. There's a much higher demand than there used to be. More and more people are want to go into tertiary education. And what this has done is, this has caused more public universities and more private universities to be established. Now, obviously, a public university, we've seen, I think, 2 established recently. There's one up in Northern Cape, I think it's the Saul Plaatje, and I think there's one in what's Nelspruit called these days. I think there's a second one in Nelspruit. But by the same token, the private higher education institutions in South Africa has far outstripped the establishment of the publics. And I don't have the numbers in front of me at the moment, but we're getting close to the point where there is almost as many seats available in private higher education institutions as there are in publics. And I think in the next couple of years, we'll surpass the publics. If you count distance education, the way you guys are studying, if we count that, then definitely there are more seats in private higher education than in publics, because many institutions have grown. And even with UNISA, I think we may even be past that point. But when you've got a lot of new universities starting, and private universities, if there isn't proper quality assurance, then you have a problem. Because now these guys are simply popping up and they're dishing out degrees left, right, and center. And those degrees need to be at the standard of everybody else, both in the interest of the institution, but also in the interest of the student. So there's 3 things that we look at: assessment, improvement, and delivery of educational services are the blueprints that it provides. So in other words, we tend to see quality control mostly in assessment, but it needs to play a role in improving yours, and I'm going to come back to assessments, in improving your delivery or improve your overall educational structure, but also the delivery of your educational services. So, for example, we are mandated, Department of Higher Education says that every lecturer needs to be reviewed, the delivery needs to be reviewed once a year. So every tertiary lecturer in the country must be peer reviewed once a year. And the question is, what form does that peer review take? And does it happen at all institutions? Is it actually something that happens? I know it's one of the dramas that I have on my desk, that I've got to allocate staff to peer review some of our part-time lecturers and so on. And it's quite a big thing. So we do that. And I get into serious trouble if I haven't ensured that that happens. But does it happen everywhere? And then assessments, of course, because assessments is the easiest place to put quality control in place, because that determines how difficult it is to get your qualification. But you can't simply up the quality of your assessment and say, now my qualification is a better qualification, if you are not completing the rest of the cycle in terms of delivery and in terms of allowing people to learn in a better environment and allowing people to have a better experience within the higher education services. Then trends in terms of leadership and support. So if your leadership is not, somebody's mic is open. Does somebody want to ask a question? Okay, I think it's closed now. Thanks. I don't mind if you open your mic if you want to ask a question. But so if you don't have institutional heads that are pushing for proper quality control and managing the quality within higher education institutions, then you're going to start wavering, because then your staff that is responsible to ensure that the standards are met are not being held accountable, and then your standards are going to slip. I had quite a robust discussion early in the week about how do we measure lecturing staff, and then people say that's easy. How many people pass their class? And that is the worst possible measure you can have, because it's the easiest one to manipulate. And not only is it a manipulative, or manipulatable, is that the word, manipulatable? But it's also bad news for your institution, because now the quality comes down because the lecturer is concerned about their jobs. So they're passing people that shouldn't pass. And your assessment can be as good as you want to have your assessment. But if your assessment standard is great, but the person marking your standard or marking the assessment is marking at the wrong standard, you have a problem. And there's, in our organization, there's an endless debate, because we've got 9 campuses. So are the 9 campuses all assessing at the same level? So the assessment is the same, but is the marking the same? And one of the quality measures that we have in place is we've got standardization calls for many subjects, where people sit around, they meet electronically from all campuses, and everybody that marks sits and they talk through the exam paper or through the test paper, and they decide what is an acceptable answer. There's a memo answer, but obviously in many subjects your memo isn't a verbatim of what you expect the student to say. So if the student's got to analyze a case study and apply certain models to the case study, there's going to be great differences in your subjects, in the various subjects you guys have at the postgraduate level. The answers differ vastly, and if you've got more than one person marking it at more than one campus, then those people need to speak to each other to make sure that the faculty and staff ensure that the quality is right and that they hold themselves accountable to the standards that the institution has set for that specific subject. And that can only happen if the institution and the management and the leadership in the institution supports and demands that culture of quality and accountability. So let's have a look at the international trends. So I've spoken about South Africa quite a bit, but let's look at what's happening around the world. So there's this move, and it goes with the managerialism, and I'll speak a little bit about managerialism just now. But there's an international move where industry models have started to emerge as the models of quality control within higher education. So obviously, there's total quality management, there's Kaizen, there's even what's the black belt one, and numerous others that are all the ISO standards, etc. That are quality control mechanisms that are used in industry, ranging from insurance through to manufacturing industries, right? And those things have built in, they've been developed and tested repeatedly. The question is, how reliable are these models in the higher education field? And where you have higher education institutions that are being run as businesses, and this is what's happening internationally, you have managers coming in that do not come from the educational field. Because we see it locally in our schools, for example, more and more schools are appointing principals that are business managers, and then you have a deputy principal academic. And they call them deans, and they've got all sorts of fancy names for them. And that's something that we see internationally, where private higher education institutions are appointing business managers to run it. And may I use the word bean counters to run the business. The problem is they come with industry type of quality control measures that do not always translate into the higher education. And because they come out of industry, they don't understand higher education, and then you start running into problems with your higher education. TQM is one of them. So it's a model that has become popular in higher education. And it's got a lot to do with stakeholder involvement, and total quality management it's called total quality management because it looks at the complete cycle. So it will look at all people that are involved, all the different stakeholders that are involved, and in private higher education, you probably include even the parents, because in many cases, on a campus, not so much on the online campus, but on a face-to-face campus, the parents are heavily involved because they are the account payers. And the whole idea in private higher education has become popular that because we're paying a premium, we want a premium service. I've got no problem with that. But they also expect a premium client service to the extent that leeway must be given that would not normally be given in a higher education institution. And access needs to be given, and there's a demand for appointments. I had a demand this afternoon. I want to see you tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. And if we say no, then the parent's really upset. I've got another demand today, for example, from a parent whose son has not completed their ICE tasks. And now they want to post facto complete the ICE task, and they're very upset that the son is not allowed. And the first argument that's rolled out is, this is a private higher education institution. I'm paying a lot of money, therefore my son needs to. So now we sit with that, and we've got the stakeholder involvement in TQM, and TQM's the whole object of TQM is always looking at all the angles, all the stakeholders, and seeing how can we improve the interaction every time we do it. And it's a long-term, slowly getting better and better and better. And as long as you can satisfy the people that are in the process, TQM works well. The problem is in education, the context is different and the situation is different. If I'm dealing with a class of 70 students and 30% of those or 40% of those students fail the class, they are not going to be happy, right? But now you want a TQM model placed on that. Is the premises of TQM is that the participants have satisfaction and they are happy with the process. I had another discussion with one of our senior managers the other day, and I said to them, and as students, you guys might not like me saying this, but I said to them, because we were talking about student experience, and I said to them, acceptable student experience is not always positive. Students may have negative experiences as well, but that's part of the student experience, because resilience and grit are things that students need to develop, and you develop resilience and grit only if times get tough, only if things are difficult, if there's tight deadlines, if there's many things to do and you are struggling and you struggle through that, you develop resilience and grit. And that's what part of the hidden curriculum in tertiary education. So you can't always say participants need to be satisfied. And that's why there's questions around if TQM is the correct model to use. And some people will say definitely not, and others will say definitely yes. And then there's the people in between like myself that says, there are some processes that it will work for, but some I'm not convinced that it can work for. But the whole idea of bringing business models in and business models come with managerialism. And let me briefly talk about managerialism, because managerialism is something that internationally has taken over higher education. So, and this is not only in private higher education, it's also in public higher education. You're finding more and more that so public higher education used to be run by a group of senior academics, and they ran the institution as a senate. But senate these days don't just have academics in it. Senate has a lot of the business side in it. And senates are more and more, and senates, there's many other names for them, but the governing bodies of higher education, more and more have business people in it. And business people make more and more business-like decisions. So for example, those of you that have been in higher education for a while would have in the past 5 to 10 years experienced that there's a lot more admin that needs to be done and a lot more reporting that needs to be done by academics, and it wasn't so previously. And the reason for that is managerialism. The bean counters, the people that come from the business side don't understand education, and there's this belief that if a person who is a lecturer is not in the class, they're not working. Right? So we need to make sure that these guys are productive. So we need to split their days up and see what are they doing every hour. We need to put performance mechanisms in place. We need to demand that they do additional things. We need to move other administrative tasks away from administrative people to them to keep them busy. Things such as, for instance, capturing marks. Things like, for instance, helping with registration and helping with non-academic parts of registration and a whole host of other things, and reports on this, that, and the other, and sometimes the same report to 3 different people, just in a slightly different way. And that's all a way that business models have been brought in to monitor higher education, to attempt to get quality. But in fact, it's questionable whether things like budget management, resource allocation, stakeholder engagements, whether it really has a place on the academic side of higher education. And the effect that that has on teaching and learning is a big question. And if your teaching and learning starts to slip, then one needs to ask questions about your academic integrity. And I'm not talking about academic ethics. I'm talking about the robustness of the education that you're giving to the student. And the student and the completeness of the student that you're delivering at the end of the day. Because quality management in higher education is about the product that you put on the table. Now, I sound like a business person talking about students as products. But you need to go look at that student, and you need to understand not just what the knowledge is, but what the skills are, what the ethical standards are, what the work ethic is, etc., 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 and the complete student that you've produced after a period of study within your organization. Now, I briefly referred to the private higher education institutions earlier, and this is expanding in South Africa, but in the world as well, because there is a demand for certain things in higher education. And one of those demands are standards. And many people believe that the standards in public institutions have started to waver, and they therefore start to put their trust in private higher education institutions because they're paying more, but they can also demand a higher standard. But this also creates a problem because now you're dealing with an institution that's primary motive is making money. And their primary motive is not higher education. So one has to then question, do these private higher education institutions balance the money motive with the higher education motive? And how do they ensure that the money motive doesn't detract of the quality that they're delivering in terms of education? And when decisions have to be made, and something's got to give, does education give, or does the money-making motive give? And those are the things that your quality assurance structures need to make sure that they address. And in theory, our regulatory framework, where we've got people like the Council for Higher Education, Department for Higher Education and Training, South African Qualifications Authority, etc., things you should be quite familiar with by now, need to set standards. But there's also a problem there, because these regulatory bodies in South Africa, unlike many other countries overseas, are fragmented. So the CHE sets one standard, DHET sets another standard, SAQA sets another standard, and how do we then align those standards with each other? And as private education institutions, how do we then meet all those standards and have our own quality assurance mechanisms that get us to the standard that we want to be as an institution, yet we align with the various regulatory bodies and we align with international best practice. So you're juggling a lot of balls, and to get the perfect balance between that is not easy. And many private higher education institutions actually really struggle with that to get that properly right. So what do we do about this? Firstly, leadership capacity. If you don't have proper academic leadership, you will never have proper quality management that is academic quality management. I'm not talking about organizational quality. I'm talking about academic quality. And you need to have academic leadership that understands the academic side, but understands quality assurance principles. And that they know how to balance the business with the academia to make sure that the learning outcomes that the students experience are at the right standard, but also they need to make money. Because at the end of the day, that's why the institution survives. So you've got this thing where you've got to balance the money with the student and the employability of the student. It's very easy to say, give him money and I'll give you a certificate, right? But those people won't get employed. So the next guy's not going to part with his money that easily, because why will I part with my money if the piece of paper that you're giving me is not worth anything? And to do this, there's two key things: the teaching methodologies and the curriculum design. So your curriculum needs to be at a level where it meets and even exceeds the standards that are set by organizations such as SAQA, such as the South African Qualifications Framework. Sorry, I said qualifications framework, I meant the NQF, the National Qualifications Framework, and the various other regulatory bodies. And if you can get your curriculum design, in other words, you've got a curriculum that's a robust curriculum that covers what it needs to cover, and you can then have teaching methodologies that are the right teaching methodologies, that are probably constructivist in nature and true constructivism, not the constructivism that many institutions hold as constructivism, which is not really constructivism. But that requires investment in your faculty. The teaching skills need to be developed. They need to be taught how to do these things. You can't say we follow a constructivist teaching model, but you've never taught anybody who's teaching for you how to teach in a constructivist manner, how to give feedback in a constructivist manner. And then on the other side, it's all great to be in this isolated academic world, and we've got this great curriculum and we've got this great teaching methodologies, but we need to make sure that that aligns with what industry wants. So in other words, your curriculum design and your curriculum content needs to align with what industry needs. And I will give you the simplest example. We all in higher education are still grappling with what do we do with AI and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in terms of AI usage. And industry is using AI. How do we train our students to use AI in an academically ethical manner, but also in a manner that would be good for the student to be able to use AI when they go into the world of work? Because there's no use us saying, no, don't use AI. Students will use AI. You guys all know you use AI. But how do we get students to use AI in a way that's appropriate academically, but also is training them for the world of work, making them have that AI skill, making them more employable, but also that they don't rely only on AI, that they are able to think, because that's what the work wants. They want you to be able to think, use AI, but put your own brain in there, because otherwise they don't need you. They can just ask AI to do whatever they want to do. So that's one example of how our curriculum design and our teaching methodologies, whilst meeting the quality standards, also need to meet the industry standard to make the people that we put out on the other side, to make them employable. You also need to look at streamlining your QA processes. If you have these very complex, very difficult QA processes, the burden of them becomes so heavy that nobody wants to do them. Nobody wants to use them. They tick the boxes because they have to tick the boxes, but it's not actually quality assurance. So you need to streamline it to make it easy. But unfortunately, the problem there is, as a private higher education institution, or as a public higher education institution for that matter, it's all fine and well to say, yes, I'm going to streamline my process and everything. The problem is all those regulatory bodies that I mentioned earlier all have their own ways and their own things they want you to do. So your QA not only has to be streamlined for you to have a real QA and to do what you want to do in terms of quality assurance, but you also need to meet the regulatory frameworks of the different bodies. So Suddenly you've got a lovely streamlined one, but it doesn't meet there. So now you've got to put more fluff in to meet all the regulatory authorities' demands. And that becomes problematic. All the private higher education institutions in the country is currently on a massive drive to increase the research output, because if you want to become a university, you're going to have research. So there's massive pressure to do more research. The problem is what we need is more research on our sector, on the higher education sector, to understand how the sector works, and especially the private higher education sector, what the dynamics are that are playing out there, how the challenges are faced, but also how these institutions are changing the face of higher education. Because there's a grave danger that our private institutions go in one direction and our publics go in another. And then you're going to have two higher education sectors in the country, and we can't afford it as it is. Many people will tell you the standards at various universities are not the same, notwithstanding what I spoke about earlier in terms of how we ensure that the standards are actually supposed to be the same, but the standards are not the same. And now you've not only have you got a divide within the public universities not being on the same standard, and privates not being on the same standards, because you get better and worse privates and you get better and worse publics. You also have privates going in a direction and publics going in a different direction, and then you've got a completely fragmented higher education system, which no country can afford. So we need to do more research to find out where are we in terms of the higher education system. So we do a lot of research in how we deliver learning, how our students learn, how we must approach certain subjects, but we don't actually look at the sector, and that's something that we need to do. And then, and this links to what I've just said, there needs to be some kind of a collaborative effort between privates, publics, the regulatory bodies, the stakeholders. Everybody needs to come and sit around the table. The problem is there's within the private higher education sector, there's very strong competition. If you look at institutions like Stadio and Varsity College, they're in strong competition with each other. And then if you then take them and you look at the way that the public looks at privates, because many public institutions will tell you privates aren't real universities. They sell their degrees, and people don't really have the knowledge that when they leave the privates. Lots of publics hold that opinion. I personally know they're wrong, but yes. And how did we then build trust amongst the privates themselves, but also between private and public? And then you have the regulatory bodies that are looking at the regulatory bodies are used to the publics, and many of the people come from publics that work for the regulatory bodies. And now they're looking at these privates and they're saying, but how can you have one university that has 9 campuses? How can you tell me that you are a education provider and you provide distance education and face-to-face education for the same qualification, and you believe the standard is exactly the same and the student you're putting out is exactly the same? They don't see that working, and all the big privates are struggling with those same things from the regulatory bodies. So that's the last thing that we need to look at, is that we need that collaborative effort. Folks, that's in terms of what I have for you around quality assurance. That's my story. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because then I can see what you guys are saying and wanting to do. But are there any questions? Is there anything about quality assurance in higher education? I can now also see the chat. So Some of them are experiencing load shedding, others experience issues with logging in the network. Yes, I'll do that, Lisa Mello. Lisa Mello, I see your question about uploading uploading it tonight. I can't upload it tonight, and I'll tell you why. Because it takes anything from 6 hours to 12 hours to or the process before I can get to the recording. But I will tomorrow morning, I'll undertake tomorrow morning, first thing I'll upload it. But unfortunately I can't, simply because the recording will not be available. Any questions around quality control, quality assurance, anything, anybody wants to ask anything about that before we move on to ask if there's any questions about the assignment? Okay. That ship has sailed. Assignment. Is there any clarification? Anything people want to ask about the assignment? Anything people need to know? Anything that you're worried about? Mohammed?
Hi there. I just wanted to ask with regards to some clarity on the assignment. Should we focus on a single leadership theory, or should we compare multiple theories when we're proposing our solution in this assignment?
Give me a second. If I remember correctly, I just have to get my head around this quickly, and I'll tell you why. Because there's two questions that's coming up in my mind, and I'm trying to remember which one's in this assignment, because your final assignment also has a question. The POE also has, and in the final one, you've got to do lots. If I remember correctly, in this one, it is only you should propose a management style. But give me a moment. I'm just checking something quick. I'll tell you now. It's the first question is management and leadership. Key skills. You're talking about the third question, gender diversity.
Yes.
Yes, one theory. One theory only. And why you want to use that theory. Okay. So you need to so that question is a very tricky question.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why it's tricky. Because you've got 500 or 600 words to do that question in. And there are a number of hurdles you need to jump for that question. So I would literally, in terms of the leadership style, right, I would say something like, and folks, don't quote me on this. This is a bad example. The one I'm going to say now is not the one you want to use. I would say something like, I would propose an autocratic leadership style, because we must force leaders to employ more women and develop women. And that's the only style that's going to allow us to do that. That will be my whole management and leadership story for that question, because you need to give attention to gender and diversity. And that's the crux of the question. So I would spend more words on doing my gender and diversity side, and then I would on the management, because the rest of the assignment takes care of a lot of the management parts.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yes. Thank you. Okay, I do have another related question.
No problem.
I know, should we also try and tie in any international perspectives with regards to gender diversity, or should we just focus strictly on South African context, or can we pull from the international perspective?
It doesn't matter. Okay. So it's up to you to answer the question that you want to. I would definitely not only look at international perspective. If I'm going to bring in the international, perspective, I would say internationally, this is what's happening. From that international perspective, in the South African context, we have the following.
Okay.
So you need to, if you want to bring in the international perspective, it'll be a great thing to do. But you need to pull it through back to the South African context. What all of you need to remember, the answers to these questions are diverse. There isn't a memo that says to me, mark the following things, right? The memo in essence is my rubric. And if you meet what the rubric tells you to do, you could do it in any way you want to. Right? You have a lot of freedom, much more freedom than you'd have in an undergrad. What you need to do is, at the end of the day, my recording that I made on it is just a broad guidance as well. When you're finished writing your answer to a question, go read the question again and say, have I answered that question? Full well knowing that the other people in the class are going to answer those questions in a different manner. Right? But there's not just one answer, there's many answers. So and that should be your approach. Go for it. Don't be afraid to go for it. Go for it and write an answer that you think this answers the question. Also, something else, and Corin, I'm going to be with you now. I see your hands up. Something else you guys need to keep in mind is you will not be able to answer the complete question. Because any one of those questions could, in essence, be a research project. That's how wide it is. So you need to decide, how am I answering this? Where am I focusing? And answer it in your way. And cover what you need to cover and walk away from it. Okay.
Thank you so much. Corin? And then one last thing. Sorry,
okay, no problem.
Is there a specific format that you recommend for structuring our proposal part of the section? Can we do like I see Nawal also Lisimelo also asked, and Nawal also asked about the format. Is there a specific format? Is there something that you can share with us? Do we need to do it like bullet form or point form? Yeah.
What I can say is they asking for essays. Don't do bullets. Don't do bullets. Try to stay away from bullets. Try to do essay. I know with a word it is word count is difficult, but try as far as possible to stick to bullets. To essays and not bullets. There are sections that you can say, if you're writing an essay and you're saying, and the following 3 points are key, then you can make 3 bullets. But you can't answer those 3 questions by bullet points, the whole question. So you can use bullets, but you can't answer the question only by bullets. And I'm gonna go on. I'm not sure who it was that also asked it's Lisimelo that asked for examples. Should we use current examples or past examples? So I've got a very strange way of looking at examples. Does your example illustrate the point? That's my test of an example, right? Obviously, for some questions, more current examples would be better. But unless they're asking you for a specific industry example, the gender question at the end asks for an example of a success story, which I think is overkill. There also, I wouldn't go too long, because you're going to run out of words if you've answered the rest of the question properly. But any other examples? My test of an example is, does it illustrate the point? You can make up examples. You can say, for example, and then make up an example. If a university was to do blah, 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 I'm happy with that. Does it illustrate the point? Does it show your understanding of the point? As long as it does that, I'm happy with the example. I've had in business management, now that's a different subject, I've had students give me examples that I know they were talking about Pick n Pay selling off their stores as franchises. And when the student wrote that answer, Pick n Pay was actively repurchasing those stores and ending the franchises. But I was fine with the example because the example, although factually wrong, illustrated the point. And that's all I'm interested in. Corin, it's been a long time to get to you. Please go for it.
Hi, thank you. I was also interested in the same question that Zach was asking, so it's okay. I just wanted to ask about our rubric for this task. I found the rubric for the previous task split up the criteria into quite an unusual division. And there were some elements of the rubric that I wasn't sure how I was going to meet that criteria. One of them is writing style. So you're not looking for a formal academic essay. Or are you looking for a formal academic essay? What writing style is going to help us nail that particular element? Because in this task, we've got a whole lot of explanation, and then we've got a proposal, which a proposal in itself has got its own way of being constructed.
Let's talk about the proposal part, and then I'll get back to the rest of it. I get the sense from what Zach was saying, what you were saying, that there's a sense that you're writing a proposal as in the way you've been taught to write a research proposal. Let's take
just like a business proposal.
Take the word proposal and put the word suggestion in there.
Okay.
And write a suggestion on what we can do.
Okay.
If that helps you.
So it's not like a formal business proposal.
It's not, dear shareholders, this is how we're going to do this, and this is the steps we're going to follow, and so on.
Okay.
It needs to be a suggestion on what we can do to fix the problem.
Okay.
And I in the past, students have simply written a paragraph or two on the problem is the following. How we can remedy the problem is the following way, that we can do the following things. And that's to me, that's totally acceptable. The tone, the writing tone should be formal and should be academic in nature.
Okay, thank you.
So not an informal chat around the braai, something that you'd be happy to be read out at a conference, or to be published, or to be emailed to colleagues to say, look at the suggestion, look at this essay, something on the more formal end of things.
Okay.
And that's the tone we're looking for.
Thank you.
Anything else, guys? Okay. Just one thing, please. And I was reasonably lenient with the previous one, and the pressure is getting more and more to get less lenient. If you're going to use AI, please make sure that you understand how to disclose AI, the usage of it. I don't have time to explain it to you now, but there's a specific declaration. If you drop an email to the information specialist at the online campus, they'll refer you directly to the part in the policy that tells you. So in essence, you need to add an annexure to your work to say, this is the AI I used, this is what I did with it, this is where I use it, this is how I use it, and then this is where you can access the questions I asked the AI and the answers the AI gave me. The safe side of this is never ask it the question you need to answer. And you must declare, if you use any form of AI, if you're putting it through one of the language bots just to fix your language, to your writing style, you need to declare that. Because what's going to happen is, I'm going to, on the AI detector, I'm going to see AI has been used. There is no declaration. The instruction to me is report. There isn't leeway, right? If the AI detector tells me you have used AI and you haven't made a declaration, I have to report it. And the problem with that is it's seen as a level 3, which is quite a serious infringement. It means you get naught for the assignment, etc., etc., etc. So please do the AI declaration. That's what I'm saying to you. Okay. Anything else before we say goodnight?
Yes, sorry, Carl,
Zach?
about the ICE tasks. Tomorrow is the cutoff for ICE tasks. So I just want to confirm, because I need to complete them.
So no, what I need to say to you is the cutoff for ICE task was actually on Wednesday, right? Sorry, not Wednesday, yesterday, Tuesday. Today's Thursday. Wednesday, yes, it was yesterday. I have not captured my ICE task, so I am in trouble, right?
Okay.
I will be capturing tomorrow. What is there tomorrow when after I've uploaded this and so on, and I start capturing, is what I will capture.
Okay, gotcha.
So read between the lines what you want to read between the lines.
Okay, no, I'll make sure it's done tonight.
Okay.
Yeah,
Corin, Corin, you on iStasks, you will not get feedback except that you will see that there's a mark for it. So yeah, if your iStask is wrong, I will tell you it's wrong, and I'll give you feedback, and I'll say this is incorrect. Please check X, Y, and Z. Further than that, you'll see that you've got all the iStasks count 5 marks. You'll see you've got 5 marks for the iStask. That's how feedback for the iStask is going to be. There was, what else was there? Hi, there's a quick source using this. So, and the summative must be between. All sources should be, except if they're seminal, should be younger than 5 years, right? So always aim for 5 years or younger. I'm not pedantic about it. The problem with this subject is many of the source documents are quite old. So when you're using legislation and so on, you're old. But when the department has made a plan in 2013 and they've updated it 3 times since then, I would like to see that you're using the most recent updated version of it. But some of those plans are older, and I understand that. That's why I'm not pedantic. But where you're using sources, authors that have articles and so on, please try to keep them in the past 5 years. Should we also reference if we asked AI to explain certain parts of the side? If you, Mr. Mello, if you spoke to AI, you need to declare it, right? Because you think it's not going to detect it. It may just detect it. It's safer to say this is what I used AI. I actually wrote a thing to a student the other day, that I said to him, I'm so grateful that you declared your AI usage, because the way in which you used AI was perfect, right? Because I went and looked at the conversations. It was perfect. If he hadn't declared it, he would have been in serious trouble. But he declared it, perfect usage of AI, no problem, and no foul. But yes, if you spoke to AI at all, rather declare it, and then you're on the safe side. Anything else? Anything you want to ask me? Anything you want to say? Everybody happy? Okay, guys. Please also, if you've got a burning issue, please drop me an email. This weekend I'm not going to be marking the whole weekend, so I might be a bit slow this weekend. But I will be behind my computer from time to time the weekend, so I will also over the weekend be able to respond to your emails. But I try to respond within 24 hours, unless I'm on a conference or something like that that makes it difficult. Okay, I'm going to say good night. Thanks, guys. Good luck. Speak to you soon.
Thanks, babe.